Okay, so let's talk about some of the other technology issues that affect privacy, and then we'll move into electronic voting. Um, Privacy preserving data mining is an interesting concept, and we've already had a lecture on differential privacy, essentially covering the basics of what it is and why it's useful. I'll just say for here, data mining has similar concerns, right? Just removing identifying information is not enough to address a lot of the privacy issues with data mining. Just perturbing the values in the data, changing the values a little bit, affects the utility of the data. It may end up actually affecting the analysis that you end up doing or the results that you end up concluding from the actual data mining challenge. And often just focusing on aggregate or correlative statistics isn't enough, right? It's not really enough to get at the answers that you're interested in. So there's this fundamental tension between privacy and utility when you're talking about data mining in basically any context. Sometimes in some contexts, you can get to the point where aggregate statistics or correlations can be enough and could be done reliably even with slightly perturbed data. And I think differential privacy is a good example of how you might be able to do that. But that doesn't necessarily mean it will always and forever be the perfect solution. Often we're going to end up having to choose between utility and privacy, and those choices are not easy to make or reason about. A very important long-term threat that you're going to have to consider as you move off into your careers. Web surfing. There are at least 3 technologies that we've talked about previously with behavioral advertising that have important implications for privacy. Cookies are a good example. They're a way for us to address that stateful nature that we want for a stateless protocol in the HTTP protocol. But they can contain sensitive personal information, and they can make it easy for third parties to track you in ways that you wouldn't want to be tracked. In particular, third-party tracking cookies, which are specializing in tracking users, and used in a wide variety of popular sites, have a lot of privacy problems. And this is one of the reasons why Safari has already removed third-party tracking cookies, and you can no longer use them if you're using the Safari web browser. Google Chrome has promised in 2021 at some point to remove the ability for third-party organizations to place tracking cookies. So we may actually see this one go away relatively quickly, but the same basic problem applies to any tracking technology, that once you've developed an information tracking mechanism, it may end up being used for things other than the one that you originally developed it for. This is an ongoing conversation with COVID-19, simply because we want to be able to track who people are seeing and thus potentially exposing folks to. And we want to be able to do so even retroactively. So for example, let's say that I were to get a COVID-19 test tomorrow and it turned out that I was positive. If you had a comprehensive record of everywhere that I've ever been, essentially location data from my cell phone, you might be able to correlate that with location data from everybody else's cell phone and see who I may have exposed to COVID-19 while I was asymptomatic but yet positive. This is problematic, though, because if you leave that sort of infrastructure in place, or if you have that sort of infrastructure ready and available at the drop of the hat, it could be used for things that would be potentially less than helpful from a societal standpoint. And then finally, we talked about web bugs, this notion that you can use something other than a cookie to provide immediate information about whether or not a user has viewed an email or had access to some other behavioral advertising service. These are the kinds of technologies that we're going to have to be looking at going forward for internet use, for web surfing and privacy. Spyware is another broad category of technology that we're going to be interested in for the foreseeable future, in part because the advertising industry is sort of the spyware industry, right? The advertising industry really wants to get tons and tons of information about their users in order to know what it is that they find interesting or what they're engaging with. But it's kind of the same thing that spyware is trying to do, trying to get tons and tons of information about users for other purposes, maybe identity theft, maybe just general stalking. Maybe this is somebody who's interested in selling a platform to allow all kinds of nefarious activity, domestic abuse, human trafficking, that sort of thing. And because of that, it's very, very dangerous. It can be very, very dangerous to have this sort of stuff just floating out there. Adware is kind of an interesting concept. It's the actual examples of adware that are mentioned in the textbook are a little bit outdated now, but I think the concept remains powerful, and it's the sort of thing that we're going to continue to see, especially on new platforms. You can kind of look at Bitcoin as a leading example of this, because Bitcoin, the financial piece of it, the cryptocurrency piece of it, is sort of like stumbled backwards into every financial problem that the financial regulation industry has already found and addressed, because it's new and different and technology oriented and not managed by a central authority, and there's no government that oversees it, and so on and so forth. They keep running into the same financial problems that we've seen time and again in the real world, or in fiat currency world. The same kind of concept is happening with adware, I think. We're in a situation now where the actual examples seem a little bit antiquated, but in a mobile environment, sometimes they're happening and getting away with this sort of stuff, and running into exactly the same kinds of problems that we saw on the traditional web back in the 90s and early 2000s. One good case study of the kind of spyware problems that we're seeing is the Lower Merion School District. Previously, when I was presenting this sort of stuff to class, I would have this data here hidden, and then we would bring it in as after you've had a chance to guess at it. So it's worth kind of pausing a moment and thinking about these numbers and the significance of these numbers, because I'm not able to do that just presenting it here as I am now. But the Lower Merion School District, which is outside of Philadelphia, it's actually the high school that Kobe Bryant went to. It provided 2,306 students with laptops for school, and they were free to take them wherever they wanted and do with them whatever they needed to do. Now, they didn't tell the students that they had actually installed spyware on the machines that they could use to monitor students through the webcam. And this is the main reason why the school district was sued, because they ended up capturing over 66,000 images surreptitiously. The lawsuit ended up costing the school district $610,000 in a civil settlement. And the actual cost of the laptop program to the school district was $2.6 million. So a significant sum of money that ended up eventually just sort of being a good example of what not to do from a privacy perspective in terms of monitoring. And again, I think you could take this case study and look at it as a great example of how we have yet to really learn these privacy and security lessons, because a lot of school districts right now are trying to rapidly throw together a program that does essentially the same thing, so they can monitor student study habits in response to COVID-19 social distancing policies that keep students from actually being on campus or in school. And that sort of surveillance is always problematic. Maybe you can get an educational benefit by ensuring the students are actually using the laptops for educational purposes, but it's impossible to separate that educational benefit from problems like this. Some of the Lower Merion students were captured doing things in their bedrooms that you would not want to see high school students doing in their bedrooms. In fact, the whole lawsuit started because somebody was brought into the principal's office and told they were violating school policy for marijuana possession. And the student was like, I never brought it to campus. I never brought it to the school. I don't know how they could possibly have found this out. And eventually they found out, it was because they were smoking weed in their bedroom, and the laptop webcam found them. Same kinds of problems that we saw way back here in 2010, we're now seeing again in 2020, but at a much larger scale and in response to a pandemic. All right, let me see. Let's see. Yes, a few more slides. Okay, so corporate surveillance is another very important concern that's not really going to go away. It's very similar to surveilling students to see if they're doing schoolwork, right? We want to make sure that our employees are doing what they're supposed to be doing, and only that, right? And I love this quote from Bruce Schneier here. The NSA didn't wake up and just say, let's spy on everybody, and they looked up and said, wow, corporations are spying on everybody. Let's see if we can get a copy. That's the sort of thing that's happening now. We're trying to figure out what people are doing online, what people are doing with our interactions with these various organizations. Facebook is a good example. They're trying to figure out all kinds of behavioral information about you and your friend groups, or you and the things that you like. Google is essentially doing a similar process, but at a little bit more distributed scale. Palantir, maybe they're trying to capture everything from a surveillance perspective. It's kind of hard to get good information on what Palantir's business model really looks like, because many of their clients are governments and they don't really say very much about what they're doing. There's a large number of other companies that are doing this sort of stuff purely for credit worthiness and job worthiness. We call them data brokers like Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion. And essentially they're just trying to produce surveillance, right, on what the general populace is doing. So what does this have to do with you and your career? Basically, I want you to go into the corporate world with your eyes open and understand that the nature of this technology is that it can provide benefits, but that it is also somewhat dangerous. If you understand how this technology relates to society, you will be much, much better positioned to make strong ethical decisions about what we should and shouldn't do. It's not that we don't want any kind of corporate surveillance. It's not that we don't want companies to help us keep in touch with our friends or record movements of people from a financial perspective or job worthiness perspective. We do need some of this, right? You want to be able to get hired at organizations that don't know you personally. It's helpful, but it has to be done ethically, right? In the same vein, we want to be able to track the spread of something like COVID-19 in a society that values security, privacy, and freedom. We have to do so with the understanding of this trade-off, and it's not easy. It is a very complicated thing to do. So don't think of this as something that's going to get solved and disappear. It's going to be a part of your career if you stay in information technology for the rest of your life. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about email, because email is another good example of a technology with lots of privacy implications. And there's a couple of things that we can say about it. First, when Alice sends Bob an email, the message is transferred using SMTP. This is going to go through multiple ISPs, possibly multiple servers before it arrives at Bob's server. And when Bob receives the email, his client could log in to the server and view the email. Now, any of the servers in this chain of communication can see and keep Alice's email. By default, none of this stuff is encrypted. Email is not an encryption protocol. It doesn't include anything like that. Maybe the best case scenario is that you are Alice, and Bob is also on the same email provider. So if Alice and Bob both have accounts at Gmail, then maybe all of the protocol, or all of the servers that the protocol will send it to, would be owned by the same company, and your exposure wouldn't be all that great. But that seems a little bit unlikely, because it's entirely possible that Bob is sitting at home and the ISP at home is the one that will be doing the transfer for the email service. So what happens? Like, how can we protect email? Well, from a technology standpoint, there are technologies that have attempted to address this problem, but they're very difficult to use, right? If you're trying to do anonymous email, you might be able to get a disposable email address from a site like Mailinator. You might be able to use a remailer, which is essentially just a trusted third party that replaces your address with pseudonymous ones and then sends it through possibly a series of other email servers to make it very difficult to track. If you use multiple remailers, you could end up seeing something like a Tor type configuration that would give you stronger anonymity on the sending end. There are services that attempt to do things like disappearing email, but it's very difficult to ensure that this is actually going to be the case. And your recipient, much like Snapchat, could just take a screenshot of a disappearing message before it disappears. Or if you have one camera, you could use that camera looking at the screen to take a picture the same way that your eyes would see, that sort of thing. Google did create self-destructing emails. Proton Mail did this first. I think anonymous and disappearing email is always going to be something that we want. Right? There are lots of reasons why you might want to have this sort of thing, especially if you are interested in whistleblower type services or being able to communicate with journalists. But I think you're just going to have to get away from email as a protocol if you want to do it right, because there's too much baggage with the email protocol in general. It's not set up to protect privacy the way that you would want it to protect privacy for this sort of circumstance. And then finally, I wanted to talk about RFID tags as another technology with important security and privacy concerns. RFID tags are basically small, low-power wireless radio transmitters that, when they receive a signal on the correct frequency, they can respond with some information. There's not really a lot of computing. It's basically just responding with an ID number or some other piece of information that can be correlated with a longer database entry using some kind of a web service. That said, there are still privacy concerns, right? If you're using RFID tags to track merchandise like clothes, then eventually people are going to put those clothes on and walk around, and essentially the RFID tag now tracks people rather than just clothes. Right? As they become cheaper and more ubiquitous, RFID readers can be installed in lots and lots of places, and it may eventually become possible to track people in the same way that you would see in sort of like dystopic fiction like Minority Report, where you're sort of tracking people wherever they happen to go. And that is problematic. I don't think RFID tags are the only case where this sort of thing happens, but they are among the first. This is actually something that predates cell phones, predates mobile computing, and a lot of the problems that people had with RFID are now more pervasive and easier to do using cell phone technologies than they were with RFID. But when the textbook talks about RFID, it's worth kind of inserting in your mind anybody carrying a cell phone, because all of the stuff that you can do with RFID is kind of easy to do with cell phones and Bluetooth readers as well. All right, so the last section that's coming up next, we'll be talking about electronic voting.